Okay. Yep, that started. Right. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Jamie Druckman to present to us today. I know Jamie's been a sort of friend of TeDCog for quite a long time now. So Jamie, maybe I'll let you introduce yourself and your presentation, and we can get started.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Rochester, and I guess I think of myself as a political psychologist. A lot of my work intersects with, most recently political polarization, and I've kind of gravitated in theory of kind of trust in science. And what I'm presenting today is a piece of a fairly large project on trust in science in the U.S. and kind of the origins of that, which I'll touch on, and kind of the consequences of that, which is the focus of this, and various other aspects. And so I will, with that, share my screen. There we go. Is that everybody seeing that? Hopefully.
Yes, we see the PowerPoint.
Great. Whoa, okay, great. And so this is a project. This piece of it is most directly with a former PhD student with whom I work, Jonathan Schulman. Um, but the larger project comes out of a team that I'll mention at the end. And so the title of this is The Polarization and Politicization of Trust in Science. And again, this is really focused on the US, although there are some certain trends that are certainly kind of worldwide, I believe as well. And I'm going to start, and it's kind of, I'll kind of mention why this is kind of particularly timely in a moment. So the longest running publication in the United States is actually Scientific American. It's been a weekly publication since 1845 without interruption. And originally founded to report on inventions and developments in science and technology. And it went 175 years and never endorsed a political candidate. This changed in 2020. And in 2020, they came out and they endorsed Joe Biden. They have this announcement: we've never backed a presidential candidate in our 175-year history. And then they did this, and they were far from alone in 2020 in breaking precedent along these lines. Nature came out, I think, is widely known. They came out and endorsed a political candidate. Other various publications that had never before endorsed a political candidate went ahead and did this. I mentioned that this is particularly timely because there's been a bit of a kerfuffle with Scientific America in the last few days. In fact, that they came out and endorsed the Harris again this year, and then after the election, the editor put out a series of tweets that kind of talked about Trump voters as bigots and basically horrible people, and that led her to her resignation. And so it's kind of relevant for that reason. And so I'm going to come back to kind of why this come back to the end at the end, kind of why I think that's kind of relevant that scientific publications are doing that. But let me position this kind of in the larger kind of American context. And as is well known, there's these trends of pretty substantial American divisions over the last 50 years, depending on how you count. So the top graphs here are Congress, and on one side is the Senate, and one side is the House. And these are fairly typical graphs many of you have probably seen before of ideological polarization in those bodies. And then the bottom graph is affective polarization amongst the mass public. And these are just feeling thermometers from 0 to 100, 0 being very cold. And the blue line is what people think of the other party. The kind of orange line is your own party, and you can see this monotonic decline over time, where people are becoming increasingly cold towards their own party. And so you see these kind of trends of division in America. And then kind of, so again, just stick with me for a while because I know I'm kind of jumping around a lot. You kind of have these political trends on the one hand, and then we kind of think about science. And so I'm going to just kind of turn to talking about science, and then I'm going to bring these two trends together very, very, very soon. And so the General Social Survey is probably familiar to most of you, is a large national probability sample that's been going since 1972. And they fortunately have this item. They have this battery of trust items, and one of them is, I'm going to name some institutions in this country. As far as the people running these institutions are concerned, would you say you have a great deal of confidence, only some confidence, or hardly any confidence? And one of them is the scientific community. And what you see, there are some really interesting trends behind this, which I'm not going to go into here, but they're kind of where did this polarization emerge from? But I'm gonna bracket that. And so this is the trend over time at the three answer categories: hardly any, only some, and a great deal. And so if you just focus on a great deal, the really interesting thing here is, right, if you go back to the beginning of this time series, you actually had Republicans had a larger percentage of Republicans had a great deal of confidence in science by about 9 percentage points. You go to the turn of the century, and it was virtually the same, 47% Republicans, 46% Democrats. And then you fast forward to 2022, and you have 28% Republicans and 53% Democrats, and so a 25% Democrat switch. And so over the 20 or over the roughly 50 years of this data collection, it's a 34 percentage point change. You might ask, is this just a COVID bump? And a little bit reflected COVID, but kind of in subsequent other data collections, it really is not just a COVID bump. If anything, what COVID did was Democratic trust went up a little bit, and it's come back down a little bit, but Republican trust has stayed pretty much where it is. And so you kind of have these trends. So the question I'm asking, and again, I'll come back to these political trends in a moment, but the question I'm asking is, there's a lot of, I'm far from the first person to show those trends. Like, as I said, there are some interesting dynamics behind those trends, which I can discuss if we have time. But the question that's kind of not gotten answered or explored very much is, do these trends in trust in science and trust in scientists specifically, do they have political consequences? And what I'm going to argue subsequently is that they do, and particularly partisans who perceive the other party as more scientifically distinct are going to increase in their partisan animosity. They're going to have less support for compromise, and they're going to be more likely to politicize science. And so the basic argument that I'm trying to make here is that these trends going on about the polarization of trust in scientists have political consequences. So they might have some political origins, but they also have political consequences. And I think this is quite salient because it means that some of the political divisions that we're seeing are underlined somewhat by beliefs about expertise or experts, and that's quite substantial for a lot of reasons, again, which I'll talk about towards the end. And so I'm going to talk about, briefly theoretically, kind of why we would expect this to matter. Then I'll talk about observational data. I'll watch the time. I may or may not get into the experimental data, and then I'll talk about some implications. So the question then is kind of how do these macro trends of kind of this we see these two macro trends. We see this kind of increasing American divisions in politics. We see this increasing partisan division in trust in science. How do those translate into individual beliefs? And two basic premises I think lead to a fairly straightforward set of expectations. One is if we think about trust. Trust is obviously a very fundamental concept. And in essence, you can think about trust as the acceptance of some vulnerability. If I trust another entity, I'm making myself vulnerable, right? I'm going to follow advice from that entity, or I'm going to do what that entity suggests, or emulate that entity. And in doing so, that may or may not be good for my interests. And when I do that, I'm delegating to a certain entity to follow that perspective, and then I'm going to be relying less on other entities. So, for example, in other analyses, when you look at people who have more and more trust in scientists, they're less likely to, for example, they're less likely to be populist, they're less likely to have trust in religious authorities. So there's some trade-off when you're making that trust decision. Of course, we can look at a whole host of things that people may or may not trust. I think trust in science or trust in scientists is a particularly important one. And it has a particular status. One is, it's a privileged source of knowledge. It correlates with a lot of decisions, such as vote choice, conspiratorial beliefs, and a whole host of other things. And it signifies a commitment to a particular type of expertise. And right, governments invest an enormous amount in science. We think of science as having a particular cultural authority. And so in that sense, when you're making that decision to trust in science or scientists, you're making a fairly fundamental epistemological decision of kind of where you're going to get knowledge and where that's coming from. And so if you just take those two premises, which I think are fairly non-controversial, it translates into a set of expectations into how we expect this may affect politics. Specifically, so just looking at the micro individual level, if I'm a partisan, and I perceive somebody from the other side, somebody from the other group, as relying on a distinct type of expertise, I'm going to think more negatively of them. And so that leads to a fairly straightforward expectation, and I'm going to really put a little emphasis on a particular aspect of this expectation. So as one perception of the difference between their own trust in scientists and that of the other party increases, so will their animus towards the other party. So let me be very specific on what I mean by this. What I haven't read there is the trust differential, because that's an important concept here. So that is kind of how much trust I have and how much trust I perceive the typical member of the other party to have. So it's kind of my individual level of kind of the distance between myself and the typical member of the other party. So as that increases, that means that I'm going to think the other party is more different than myself, and I'm going to have an increased animosity towards the other party. And so hopefully that's a fairly clear concept in terms of this trust differential. In terms of kind of, I'm going to bracket this, so I'm going to come back to hypotheses in a second, but we might expect people to have this be a little bit off on this trust differential. So specifically, it's fairly well established that people tend to exaggerate the other party as more extreme, more stereotypical, so on and so forth. So we might expect people to have misperceptions of what the other party's trust is. And for trust in science, for reasons that I think are fairly evident, coming back to how I started the talk, Democrats might perceive Republicans to be less trusting than they actually are, so they're going to kind of perceive this larger trust differential because they're going to perceive themselves as a certain level of trust that's probably fairly high. They're going to exaggerate the extent to which Republicans distrust science. And so this is a bit of a corollary. And on the flip side, Republicans might perceive Democrats being more trusting than they actually are, given some of the rhetorical aspects that go on in politics. So I'm going to come back. I'm going to test this. This is a bit of a corollary. But coming back to the main hypotheses, so the first hypothesis is increase in trust differential increases animosity. A second hypothesis concerns compromise. So governance, this is a kind of coming back to a fundamental aspect of politics, requires collective action and compromise. And if you don't think that you have a shared belief system, you're not going to be very willing to compromise with the other side, right? You're going to think like, well, why should I compromise with the other party when the other party is relying on a kind of an ontology that is just foreign to mine, and I'm not going to really think that they're going to be evaluating information in a way similar to myself. And so a prediction here is kind of as that trust differential increases, you're going to be less likely to be willing to support compromise with the other party. So again, I think it's a fairly straightforward prediction following from those premises. And then a final, this is the last prediction, is just the politicizing of science. Government, another aspect of government is we delegate a lot to a variety of experts. One of those experts is scientists. The ideal delegation would be delegation to experts who provide accurate information. But the idea here is that as a perceived gap in the views of expertise increases, you're going to expect the other side to be appointing scientists who are very different than the type of scientists that you think is providing accurate information. So put another way, if I'm a Democrat and I perceive my trust differential to be very high, so I think that Republicans have a very different perception or a very different level of trust in scientists, then I'm going to expect them to kind of be relying on a different type of expert, a different type of scientist. And so I'm going to think more in partisan terms when I think about what scientists should be delegated to in government. And so put another way, as the trust differential increases, I'm going to think more in partisan terms about scientists when I'm delegating. And on the flip side, if I'm a Republican, if I think that I have fairly low trust in the typical scientist and Democrats have very high trust in the typical scientist, I'm going to think more about kind of politicizing the types of scientists that I'm going to appoint to making decisions within government. And I'll come back to operationalizing that in a moment. And so hopefully those expectations are fairly clear. If they're not, they will become very clear when I describe the data. And so first I'm going to present you some secondary data, then I'll do some observational data. I'll quickly touch on what the experiment is. I mean, the experiment is basically just getting at the causation, the causal mechanisms for the observational data that I present. And so this is just suggestive data. So this is just kind of coming back to some of the trends I presented before. And in fact, I presented both these trends in other manners. So the one is from the American National Election Study. So this is just this is just a graph of kind of what you think of the other party over time. So this is just that affective polarization graph that I showed you before. And basically what we can see, again, as I showed, is that as over time, people have become less and less, lower and lower ratings of their out party. So if we think of this as a rating of animosity, we can see animosity increased. And we kind of see over that same time period, kind of a rough, kind of macro level operationalization of this trust differential would be just the percentage of Democrats minus the percentage of Republicans who have a high degree of confidence in scientists. And we can see that that's increased over time, and it really tracks that animosity quite closely. So again, just kind of looking at these trends and kind of aggregating data, we see these trends are tracking one another quite closely. We can look specifically within the ANES data, and we can actually look at, they don't have a trust in scientists measure, but they have a thermometer of scientists measure. And so this is looking at individual level data. So what we see here is that for the blue lines are Democrats, the red lines are Republicans. And so what kind of consistent with what I suggested we might see as Democrats become more trusting of science, or they have higher thermometer ratings of scientists, their animosity towards the other party goes down. Whereas with Republicans, as they become more trusting of scientists or have higher thermometer ratings of scientists, their thermometer rating goes up. And so, right, what you would expect here is that the thermometer ratings for Democrats, as those are going up, their trust differential is likely getting wider, and so they're having more animosity. And for Republicans, as their trust in scientists in essence is going up, their trust differential might be shrinking, and so they're going to have less animosity. I know I'm talking quickly, but hopefully you're getting some sense that this is, again, from ANES data, fairly consistent with what I would expect. But of course, the ANES data does not provide the exact data that I would want to test these hypotheses. So what I did, and this is where if things are a little fuzzy, it'll become clearer hopefully with these data. So I collected new data with a sample of about 2,000 people. This is kind of a quota sample. I did it about a year ago. There were a bunch of demographics. There was a large set of controls for kind of anything that you could think about that might affect these types of outcome variables that I'm looking at. And the main items are as follows. And so this is kind of where it gets much more concrete. And so I asked a set of 8 items that measured trust in scientists. So these are things that got at your confidence in scientists, how much competence you think scientists have, how much integrity, the kind of benevolence that you think scientists have, kind of how much they worry about the public interest, and how willing you are to delegate to the other side. To scientists. And so this is just a trust in scientists battery. And then I asked the same set of questions, but instead of kind of about your own trust, I asked about your perceptions of what you think the typical member of the out party would answer these questions. So instead of asking like how much confidence do you have in scientists, I asked how much confidence do you think the average member of the other party have in scientists. So I can take these two batteries and I can compute for each person this trust differential, right? I can compute where I as a respondent stand in my own trust, and then my perception of where the other party stands. And so that's a direct operationalization of the construct that I was presenting earlier on in terms of kind of this trust differential. And then I measured partisan animosity, I measured political compromise, I did this in an abstract sense, and then I gave them a scenario where they were making a budget for NASA funding, and then I measured politicization, which is the importance of partisanship in selecting members to this. In the U.S. there's a President's Council of Scientific Advisors, and kind of how important partisanship is in that selection. So let me show you some of the results here. But first, if you remember, I kind of briefly talked about kind of perceptions of how much trust the other side have, and these are some interesting results here. So let me talk through what I'm showing you here. So what I have circled here is so ignore the rest of the figure. Just look at the kind of what I have circled here. These are all on 0 to 100 scales, and so the average Democrat had about a score of a 73 in terms of their own trust when I aggregate that 8-item battery, which scaled very tightly. Their own trust was about 73. The average Republican was at a 52. And so that's not surprising. That's just kind of that polarization in trust that I've shown you before. The more interesting thing was kind of perceptions of the other side. So what I have circled here, the 35, that is what the average score, this was when we asked Democrats what they perceived the average Republican trust to be. They perceived it to be at a 35. The actual average trust for a Republican is at a 52. So Democrats are vastly underestimating Republican trust in science. So the average Republican is pretty middling, right? They're at about 52 on a 0 to 100 scale on how much they trust scientists. But Democrats think they're a lot less trusting by almost about 20 percentage points than they actually are. So there's kind of this perception of Republicans of being much less trusting than they actually are. And then when it comes to the reverse, it's actually not what I expected here. So right, the average Democrat I've already kind of talked about has a score of 73. The average, I had thought going in that the Republicans might overestimate the amount of Democratic trust. They actually slightly underestimate it, but they're not far off from what the reality actually is. So they think that the average Democrat has about a 65 score, and the average Democrat actually has about a 73 score. And so that's kind of interesting. Republicans are actually underestimating Democratic trust, but they're not far off, right? They're about 8 percentage points off versus the 20 percentage points off that Democrats are. And so that's just kind of some interesting perceptual data. When we move to the hypotheses, right, I'm going to kind of show you kind of a set of results. And what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the results. Hopefully this will become clear when you see the results. I'm going to show you the relationship. I'm going to actually skip over this slide. So these are the outcomes I'm looking at. So I'm looking at animosity, these two compromise measures, and the importance of partisanship to appointment to this presidential council. And so basically you can see kind of the averages across these outcomes were pretty similar across the different parties. So what I'm interested in is what is the relationship between, on the one hand, the trust differential. So for each individual, I'm computing a trust differential. So this is this last bar. So this is at the individual level. I'm taking for each individual, I'm computing their own trust versus their perceived other party, and I'm taking that difference, right? Hopefully that makes sense. And so, do you have a question, Steve?
Sorry. Yeah, but why shouldn't they add up or
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, you have a very fast mind to compute that so quickly. So why do they not add up? They don't add up because the 73 and the 35, 73 is the average of all Democrats, and the 35 is the average perception of all Democrats. Whereas the 39 is taking for each individual, it's taking my trust versus my perception, and then taking the average of that. So there are some number of Democrats who actually are perhaps kind of overestimating Republican trust, and so this is kind of an average of an individual difference rather than aggregating at the full level, if that makes sense.
Except if it's the same number of individuals and there are no missing observations, it shouldn't matter.
It does. So it matters because so I'm taking the absolute difference, and so the 73. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Of course.
I'm sorry, I should have been clear. I'm taking the absolute difference. So because I'm interested in the distance of how much I think versus how much the average other party thinks. And
Okay.
so there's a little bit of variation, and that's why it doesn't add up exactly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a set of outcomes where I'm kind of showing you the trust differential, but I'm also going to show you the relationship with just trust and perceptions of the other party, because there are interesting dynamics here. And so I think just showing you a result is the best way to go. So these are results controlling for a bucket load of other things, kind of things that you would think would matter in terms of predicting these outcomes. So this is predicted animosity. And so the first graph, just focus on the first graph. So this is the trust differential. So this is the blue line is for Democrats, the red line is for Republicans. So as that kind of increases, so the more different I think that the other party is in their trusting of science, the higher my predicted animosity score is. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So this is consistent with that expectation. Of course, right, hopefully a lot of you are asking like, well, what's the causal direction here? That's a good question. I'm controlling for lots of other things, but right from these data, I can't say anything about causal direction. These are observational data, which is why I have experimental data later on. But right now, so this is showing that there is a relationship. The more that I think that the other party is different than myself in their trust of science, the more animosity I have towards the other party. The interesting thing going on here is that when it comes to, when we break it down and we don't look at that trust differential, and we just look at trust, what we see for Democrats, the trust doesn't really matter. But for Republicans, as my trust in scientists goes up, my animosity goes down, right? So as I move closer to the Democrats, I become more trusting. So in other words, for Republicans, underlying that trust differential effect, it's really about their own trust. But if we move to the last figure, for Democrats, it's really kind of perceptions of the other side. And so basically, when we just look at the trust differential, it's hiding a little bit of an asymmetry here, right? The asymmetry being, for Republicans, what's driving this animosity is for Republicans, it's their own trust level, and for Democrats, it's perceptions of the other side going on. And so that's kind of an interesting dynamic underlying that. So when we move to compromise, so I'm going to just show you the compromise result. So what we see here, again, this is kind of, it's a little, so animosity, right? Animosity, we're kind of looking at things in a different direction here, right? Because for animosity, kind of as the differential goes up, I don't like the other party here. In this case, as the differential goes up, I'm going to be more willing I'm going to be less willing to compromise. And so, right, and so these lines are going down in that first figure. So the more different I think the other party is from myself in terms of their trust in science, the less likely I'm going to be willing to compromise with them. So that's hopefully that's fairly clear. This is an interesting and unexpected finding, which if I have time, I'm going to try to come back to this. So the Republican finding is expected. As I have more trust, I'm going to be more willing to compromise with the other side. Interestingly, Democrats, as they have more trust, they're also willing to compromise with Republicans more. And so I think part of that is you just kind of basically think there's a basis for knowledge and you're more likely to engage in compromise. But that's a little bit of a surprising finding. And then we find, right, with the perceptions, again, we find that as Democrats perceive Republicans to be further away from themselves, they are going to be as they perceive Republicans to be more trusting, which means they're going to be closer, they're going to be much more likely to be okay with compromising. And the perception doesn't matter for Republicans. And then moving to the last one, I'm going to, this is the politicalization of appointments. So how much do I rely on partisan considerations and appointments to this presidential council? We asked people, we gave them like 10 different things that they could think about in appointments. And this is the only one that came out as a relation to this trust differential. So like there were a bunch of other things we asked, like expertise, experience, where they went to school, conflict of interests, and so on and so forth. So the importance of partisanship in appointment to the council. So the more different that I think that I am from the other party in terms of their trust in science, the more likely I am to think partisanship should come into play. And again, here we see kind of more consistent with the animosity results. As Republicans become more trusting of science, they're less likely to prioritize partisanship. And then as Democrats perceive Republicans to be more trusting of science, the more likely I am to not rely on partisanship as much. And so basically, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but basically the bottom line here is that in every case, the trust differential is correlating with some political outcome. So the more distant that I am, that I perceive the other party to be from myself and their trust in science, the more likely I am to kind of affect my political beliefs, whether it be animosity, whether it be compromise, whether it be politicizing appointments to this presidential council. Generally speaking, it was really own trust that matters for Republicans. So as their own trust goes up, the less likely they are to politicize things or kind of have these political outcomes. For Democrats, it's perceptions. So the more they perceive Republicans to be trusting, the less likely they are to politicize things. And so, but again, the bottom line I want you to take away here is that there's this relationship between my perceived trust and my own trust and kind of these political outcomes. So put another way, these political, this kind of trust in science and perceptions of where I stand versus the other party stands are affecting these political outcomes. I think I'm gonna just go down for a second. I couldn't see the time, so I wanted to kind of change that for a second. So, all right. So I think I'm gonna skip over the experimental evidence. Basically, the experimental evidence is kind of I'm intervening and I'm manipulating kind of either your own trust in science or the perception of the other side's trust in science. So I'm basically just trying to take the data that I just presented with you, but I'm trying to get some causal leverage, and so I'm just manipulating either own trust or perceptions of trust to show you that there is a causal relationship between what I just said. And there is a causal relationship. And the effect sizes, are range from small to medium, right? Not surprisingly, I'm not having this enormous effect on lots of things are going into animosity and compromise and politicizing. It's not just this trust differential, but in every case, the experimental evidence is consistent with what I just explained. If you're really interested in this, there is a paper underlying this, and email me, and send you the paper. I'd rather kind of skip ahead and talk a little bit about implications and show you a little bit of kind of other data, which I think are more interesting. And so one of the implications I want to talk about is kind of the effect on compromise. And so this, I think that's one of the more important results here, right? If we kind of have this trust differential that is preventing compromise or undermining compromise, it becomes very difficult to kind of operate democratically. And so I want to show you some other data on this in a moment. But I think that's one of the more politically relevant findings here, that there's some impact of this on compromise. And then kind of that this leads to this kind of cycle, right, where you kind of have polarized trust, you start to politicize science, you can't compromise, that kind of then feeds back into having polarized trust, and you kind of get into this vicious cycle. What I want to show you, though, well, let me preface what I'm going to show you, and this is just something that I looked at this week, so this is new data. And so one of the implications here is that we might have the polarized trust in science might have these democratic consequences. And so I kind of highlighted that impact of compromise insofar as trust in science increased for both parties, we saw an increase in support for compromise. And so one of the implications is that we might see, as trust in science goes up, we might see kind of tendency towards more democratic outcomes. And so what I did with that in mind is kind of said, okay, so what we might see then kind of amongst states is that states that are more trusting, we might see more support for compromise or different democratic outcomes. And so what I did is I took what this is that there are a few aspects of, let me talk you through this figure. So this is general social science data that I used earlier in the presentation. And one thing to note, and this is by state. And so one thing to notice here is that this is the percentage of kind of the percentage of people in the state who have a high degree of confidence in science. So one interesting thing here is just the graph itself is plotting the percent, and this is just 30 states because the GSS, they don't cover every state enough for me to do this. But looking at these 30 states, this is the percentage on the x-axis is the percentage who have a great deal of confidence in science in the 1970s, and on the y-axis is the percentage that have a great deal of confidence in science in the 2010s. And so one really interesting thing is the stability across the states, right? So you can kind of see that trust kind of, if you take, for example, kind of, Ohio, which is right in the middle here, kind of the percentage that had a great deal of trust in science in the 1970s looks pretty similar to the percentage that have a great deal of trust in the 2010s. So kind of why is that, and is that surprising? It's actually not surprising, and the reason that there's that kind of stability is that underlying the trust in science are these kind of very stable demographic correlates, and those stable demographic correlates don't change over time. That's a bit of an aside. The more important thing here is that we have this stability. The other interesting aspect, though, what you're probably wondering, what are these different colors that I have of these states? So I don't know how familiar you are. There is a book that came out by Jake Grumbach a year or two ago, and he developed these scores of democracy in the states. And the idea here is that he actually had data then where you could rate kind of how democratic the states were. And so what I simply did was took his data from 2016, which was really his most recent data that he had that were applicable. And I just computed kind of the states that were above the median and the states that were below the median in his democracy score. And you can kind of see that the red states are the ones that are above the median. They're the high trusting states. The blue states are the ones that are below the median, and they're the low trusting states. So you see that there's just kind of this rough relationship with trust and science. And then I just took his models. And so kind of how does this relate to the rest of my talk, other than me being like, oh, this is really interesting data? It relates to the rest of the talks because, again, kind of trust in science having some political consequence. So I took his model. So his big argument is that basically Republican states are low trusting. I'm sorry, well, that's true too, but Republican states are less democratic. So I took his model. This is ugly, sorry, because this is all very new. These are just his data. So if you look at Prof's, don't worry, there's a lot of different models here. I'm showing you all the models he did. And his big finding is that if you look at Republican, so you look at the fourth, I don't think you can see my cursor. I'm like doing a cursor and you can't even see it.
Yeah, you can.
But if you look at the fourth row here, the Republican row, you can see there's a negative relationship with democracy in the state. And that's his big finding. That's fine. But when we put in kind of this trust and scientist battery, we see this also has a really large effect on the democracy scores in the states. And so kind of controlling for partisanship, it does seem like trust in scientists is also affecting things. So just kind of as I showed with the compromise item, where higher trust was leading to more support for compromise, that seems to be manifesting as well, kind of in kind of at this kind of, when we look just at the state level, when we look just at the we have 49 states. I think one state didn't have enough data. I can't remember what exactly was going on there when we aggregated this up. You might be asking about certain data questions here, which I can get back to. Like, how did I get from 30 states to 49 states? I can answer that in a moment. But the bottom line is that as you add trust in scientists, it's not just partisanship that seems to be driving this democratic outcome, but there's actually something ontological going on in terms of kind of embracement of democracy. I have a lot of different I have more slides that I could go into, kind of what's underlying the trust in scientists, kind of how do we address this. But I think I've thrown a lot at you, and so I think I'm going to just stop with that and kind of open it up to conversations and discussions. Hopefully that you had I know I went through a lot very quickly, but hopefully you kind of have some sense. I imagine there are a lot of questions, perhaps about some of the data, what I went over quite quickly, but I think I will stop with that. I think hopefully you're getting my overall argument that I'm making here. And so I thank you for going through, that was a lot to go through quickly, at least it seemed like it. And so I will stop with that and welcome your questions.
Okay, so yeah, thanks so much, Jamie. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Because otherwise I do. I'm happy to let other people go first since I'm sharing.
You go, Dawn. I've got
Okay.
a bunch of things, so I think it's better if I wait. So
Okay. Yeah, that was really interesting, Jamie. And one of the things that you were saying about how there was kind of like an ontological issue made me think, is it kind of to do with the way we see the world? And if you think about trusting science maybe being sort of the antithesis of trusting in sort of, I don't know, a higher power, then you sort of think maybe and religiosity has to do something with it. And do you have any of that in your data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me answer that in two ways. So one is I was very slippery, and I typically am slippery when I present this because otherwise it goes into a tangent. all of my measures are trust in scientists, and that's the GSS measure, and that is distinct from trust in science. And so I want to be very clear about that now, even though I was not clear about that earlier. I did try to always say trust in scientists, but I realized that at some point I think I slipped. So there is a little bit of that distinction, and so like all the data I have is about scientists. I do think that that is a kind of an epistemological choice to trust scientists. So that's the first point. Let me answer your second point more directly though, because I do have data. I have a lot of data trying to unpack on what in the world is when you ask people what do they trust scientists, what is that actually measuring? So there are kind of three quick points on that. One is, what are they thinking about when they're thinking about scientists? And so I kind of unpack that. And they do tend to be thinking about either medical scientists or physical scientists. They're not thinking about climate scientists generally. Republicans are not thinking about climate scientists. Even when I collected these data in 2023, they weren't thinking about COVID scientists or COVID vac or biochemists. So that's basically what they're thinking of. So basically, kind of what we think of when we think of scientists, largely speaking, I think. They're not thinking about popular scientists. So I tried to unpack that. Interestingly, as a total aside, I ask about trust in a whole bunch of different types of scientists, and political scientists are the least trusted, but psychologists are not that much higher. And there's other cross-national data. There was this one study that looked at 65 different types of scientists, and that's pretty much the consistent story. So that's one point. Second point is, what do we mean by kind of trust? Right, these are kind of survey measures. Ideally, we would be doing some kind of behavioral measures. There is, and so I can't get exactly at that, but I can more directly answer your question, Don. There is a trade-off. As trust in scientists goes up, a few things go down. Specifically, what goes down is conspiratorial thinking goes down. The strongest thing that goes down is this measure of cultural populism, which is I don't know if you're familiar with this book by Eric Oliver and Tom Wood called Enchanted America, which is it's one of the more interesting books that nobody seems to read. They have this kind of measure of cultural populism, which is basically a populism measure. Knowledge comes from the people and not from experts. There's a little bit of conspiratorial element in it, and that's a really strong negative relationship with scientists. And there is a negative relationship with religion for Democrats, but not for Republicans, which is kind of an interesting thing. But that's because the populism thing is really driving a lot of Republican response. And so there is kind of this trade-off going on here. And so the bottom line though is I'm a little bit cautious. I know I kind of intimated that there's kind of an epistemological divide going on here. I think there is a little bit, but it's more about a choice of kind of the type of experts to trust, not necessarily trust in the science kind of as a method. So it's a little nuanced in that sense. So hopefully that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but I think there is a huge story about religion here, which is another part of this project, not directly on religion, but one of the reasons that we see this big partisan sorting is that people who are religious have always had lower trust in science, and they used to be divided between the parties, and they have now gone kind of entirely to the Republican Party, and there's a large section of the Democratic Party that have become completely secular. And so their religion is playing a pretty large role underlying a lot of this. So your intuition is exactly on target there in those data.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, I think Steve had a couple of questions.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, great talk, amazing data. The one thing you didn't highlight or didn't really talk about is the asymmetry
Yeah,
of all this. And very early on in your talk, you showed the congressional polarization, and it was very clear from that. And of course, I know these data from before, right?
yeah,
That the polarization is entirely asymmetrical and that Democrats over time actually haven't moved all that much, whereas the Republican Party has gone off the scale. Now, I think the reason that's relevant Well, first of all, it makes a difference to what can you do about it, right? I mean, it's sort of, and this is precisely the dilemma I want to pick up on. The reason that if I'm a Democrat and I trust science and scientists, then it would be absurd for me to show willingness to compromise with a Republican administration that's denying climate change and has an anti-vaxxer as the you know the Secretary of Health or whatever.
Yeah.
And that is what, yeah, I wonder if you can comment on that. I mean, the rational position to take for somebody in science is not to compromise with what Republicans consider to be scientists, because if you look at the lineup of people they send to congressional,
Yeah.
kabuki theaters on climate change and everything. I mean, they're not scientists. They're fossil fuel shills. So what am I supposed to do as a evidence-based scientist or politician?
Yeah, so it's a great question, especially given the moment that we find ourselves in this country. And so I guess I'll answer it kind of in two different ways. One is so I agree with your general take. And so one is the data I have obviously are really about kind of other people and not about elites. So I think that there's a really important question here, if I kind of, especially given the moment that we're in, if we had collected data kind of more specifically talking about the people that are now being appointed to kind of run our scientific institutions, which is kind of a really interesting, scary development insofar as the people who had been running those under the prior Trump administration, they weren't necessarily who you would have appointed if you were a scientist, but they weren't quacks, right? And so that's a shift. And so the data themselves can't speak. I'm going to speak directly to it, but the data themselves are a little limited in that. I do think that there's this really interesting asymmetry that's now being turned on its head, because up until this election, the asymmetry was really that Democrats were not giving Republicans enough credit for trusting science, and that might be true on the citizen level,
Yes.
right? Not surprisingly, like Republicans have like a reasonable amount of trust in science on average. Now these appointments suggest not, right? And I agree with you, right? You don't want to compromise when it comes to health when the person running health doesn't believe in science. And so I think that's right. So I think that's exactly right. But I also think that's consistent with my story that this has really bad democratic implications. Right. So because suddenly, right, this divide on science now is preventing compromise for good reason. And that's going to make governance very difficult. And kind of we can kind of say, where is the problem coming from? It's coming from one side kind of completely rejecting credible science, but it's going to make politics very difficult.
Yeah,
So I'm not
but
so I think your point is, well, that's politics should be really difficult in this moment, and I agree, but it's kind of it's a bad situation.
can I just follow up on that, Jamie? Because I think we totally agree, but I think it's also important to assign the responsibility where it belongs.
Yeah, yeah,
So, if Democrats now are unwilling to compromise with quacks,
yeah,
it is very easy to fit the trap of saying,
yeah,
oh, there's polarization and oh, the Democrats are not compromising. But to me, that would be a misattribution of
yeah,
responsibility,
yeah,
because the real problem is that they're the quacks in the first place, being appointed by a very democratically
yeah,
dubious individual.
yeah,
I mean, we all know what where the and I think it's very important to sort of keep the
yeah.
assignment of responsibility clear in this, as
Yeah,
you
I
can
think
imagine.
it's a great. Yeah, the point is very very well taken. It's a really great point, especially in this moment. And so I mean, in ideal right, part of the point in terms of kind of my talk, right? The talk was really not updated given the election. So it's a talk, and so in that sense, you're raising it, but you're raising a point that I had not. I've obviously reflected on the implications of some of this, the election for some of this, but not in the way I want to just put a kind of a highlight on something you said and make sure I'm getting it because I think it's a really crucial point. Is that at some point thinking about compromise as a part of democratic politics is I kind of frame that as like the outcome that we should be aiming for,
Right.
and at some point, but I think what I'm taking you to say, which I think is very well taken, is at some point that is not you don't want to compromise if you're putting kind of public health entirely at
Precisely.
risk, and that is
Precisely.
at that point, right? You want to like say like the priority here is public health, not compromise, and we should be thinking about why we're not compromising is because we're undermining the entire public health
Precisely.
establishment, which is again I think a development where we certainly were edging towards that through the last Trump administration, but now we are kind of squarely in kind of this reality where there could be massive, right? We could get these measles outbreaks, and so I
Precisely.
think that's yeah,
And can I just add to that, Jamie? For me, it goes far beyond public health. I mean, public health is the easiest example to illustrate it.
yeah,
It's, you got a quack, and guess what's going to happen to public health if he gets his way? And then it would be inappropriate to show any kind of compromise. But I would take that further, and I would argue that, to be blunt, you don't compromise with fascism either,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because you can't. The moment you do, you no longer have a democracy. And so this, of course, creates an incredible dilemma that doesn't have an easy resolution because the United States is at a point where, yeah, I think at a very interesting point in history, and it's far from clear what an opposition party could or should ideally do, but certainly compromising with, let's say judicial appointments that are based on loyalty to the Führer rather than competence, that the compromising there to me is just not an
yeah.
option, a democratic option with a lowercase d. And so how do you act in an environment like that? That to me is sort of entirely unclear. Um, but this idea that you should compromise and reduce polarization, I think, can now be quite counterproductive because we no longer have a democracy in which that would be appropriate. I totally agree with you in the 1970s and 80s, 90s, even, when I lived in the US. I mean, obviously, that's when this was a good thing to strive for, compromise,
Yeah.
bipartisanship, and all that kind of stuff. But now, don't know. I personally don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you. I mean, I mean, it's a great way to put it. And it comes, I guess, 2 points. One is, there's this kind of dilemma, right? In a democracy, like if the people democratically choose an authoritarian, um, what does that mean? How do you like
Yeah,
philosophically kind of put your head around that? But I think your point, which I certainly agree with, is you don't become complicit to that authoritarianism if you're the opposition party. And
precisely.
that's an important point to emphasize, which I think is not being kind of put forth a lot in rhetoric in the discussions right now. Um,
Indeed. And that is, to me, that's a real worry. And one of the reasons it hasn't been is because, people are still processing this and they still don't quite believe it, and it is a very discomforting thing to believe that you're now at a juncture where the authoritarianism or autocracy is looming so large that you really have to act differently.
yeah. No, I mean, that is a really astute analysis of the situation we find ourselves in. I guess I would just add, I mean, it's consistent with the overarching point that, we are finding ourselves in a situation where you kind of have these overlapping cleavages of, put everything into party, whatever that may be, and then you kind of have what you think of experts. And that's again not all of it. There's kind of what you think of experts. There's authoritarianism, like maybe authoritarianism is the one that's well, they're both pretty incredibly concerning. And so, yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate I think that was a great analysis of where we find ourselves. And, I think gets to a larger point of, as kind of social scientists, how do we think about what outcomes we want to be studying here? Christoph?
Did you?
Yes, thank you so much, Jamie, for this excellent talk and your sharing your thinking so far. I'm interested maybe in some of your prediction. I know predictions are always kind of a mess to ask for, but I try nevertheless. Given that we see that the current administration, or the incoming administration rather, is appointing a couple of people that are not exactly scientists, advocating for policies that are contrary to what you would expect from a scientific perception, like everything RFK Jr. basically advocated for. So now we have those people in place after 4 years, and maybe some of those policies they advocated for are not achieving the intended results. I'm wondering whether this might create spillover effects for trust in scientists, because people might not distinguish between a Dr. Ross or an RFK because he has all the expertise, and actual scientists. So now we are seeing all those people advocating for certain policies. They do not achieve the intended effects. Our other actual scientists do have
Yeah.
problems.
Yeah, that's a brilliant insight, actually, right? Because it comes back to when I was kind of my answer to Don. One of the things we found was kind of what is in people's heads when they think about scientists, and up to this point, they are thinking about people who practice science. But that could evolve, and kind of what becomes in people's heads becomes something more akin to kind of popular figures who are not actually have no scientific credentials, and that could then erode kind of their trust, generally speaking. So yeah, I think that's a great point. That's actually really appreciate you making that point, because it's something. So this project is part of this larger consortium project with David Lazare and Matt Baum and Katja Oranova, and we kind of have overtime data. So I might kind of take that insight, and we can kind of chart what people are thinking about scientists as the administration comes into right. Does that actually change over time? It's a great point that I haven't thought about. Yeah, especially you have like Dr. Oz, who's a doctor. Um, and then it's been interesting with Kennedy, because you are starting to see, like, in the news cycle, you see some Democrats saying like, well, he has some reasonable ideas. You know, by random chance, everybody has a reasonable idea. I mean,
Well, yeah, yeah, I know. Well, it's actually to me a little worse than that, because some of RFK's stuff about healthy food and all that in schools is actually not off the planet. The sort of tragedy is that he does have a few ideas that I could totally sign up for, you know. The problem is that they're all part of a cluster of bigger attitudes that are completely nuts.
right.
And so, but that, yeah, that is going to be a fun thing to do. By the way, one quick question, if you don't mind, Jamie, do you know of anybody who's starting to catalog norm violations by the Trump administration? Because, I mean, he's already now, as he put it, I don't know if you heard that yesterday. He's talking about a hostile takeover of the US government in the name of the American people. So he's not actually cooperating with anybody and following the procedure for the transition, even. He's privatized the transition and all his vetting. The FBI is not vetting his candidates, he does it himself. I mean, and this is just the beginning of a
Yeah.
mountain of norm violations. And I'm wondering if any political scientists in the US are keeping track of that, because I think it's essential to
Yeah, it's a
create a
great
record.
question. I am not aware. The people I'd ask would be the Bright Line Watch project. I don't if you're familiar with that
Who?
project. There's a project called the Bright Line Watch.
Okay.
Brandon Nyhan is one of the PIs on that.
Oh, oh, good. I
They,
know Brendan. Yeah.
yeah, and so they've been tracking norms not as systematically as I think. Yeah, Christoph put it in the chat.
Yeah. Oh,
They
good.
would be the people who would be most likely to be doing something like that, I think.
Okay. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jamie. That
Thank
was
you.
terrific. Thanks for coming. Great.